for having me. As mentioned, my name is Rob Lee. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the industrial cybersecurity firm Dragos. When I started my career, I started on the U.S. Air Force side of the house, but spent most of my time over the National Security Agency. At the National Security Agency, I ended up building out the U.S. government's mission, looking at various state actors breaking into industrial sites around the world. What we essentially do is try to identify those attacks, learn from them, and put that into new security controls or methods to try to defend and keep our infrastructure secure. For a while, I spent time on the offense as well, which means breaking into other people's infrastructure, which gave me a good perspective, not just on what we do on the security side, but what does it really mean to be the offense? What does it mean to do offensive operations like breaking into places? And off that marriage of offense and defense, really understanding the security challenge as a whole. When we look at what threats are doing to a variety of different companies and infrastructure, the reality is our threats, the teams behind them, the people on the other side of the keyboard, they're learning our systems as well, if not better than we are. And so they know our infrastructure, they know our networks, they know down to firmware and operating system levels, to hardware, to how things are connected to business processes. And so with an understanding of your organization, they can craft exactly what it would require to compromise that organization and take advantage of it. SolarWinds is a great example of this. We've talked about supply chain risks before, and it's unfortunate, but a lot of folks want to immediately think about rice grain sized chips on a hardware. But the reality is our supply chain, and the easiest ways to impact it are actually in the software. It's in the connections between our companies, and it's in understanding those business processes. And SolarWinds was a type of software, just one example of many, that's deployed in infrastructure companies and organizations and enterprises and banks and everything globally, including government agencies, with hundreds of thousands of customers. So instead of targeting each one of those companies, I could simply go after SolarWinds and put my malicious software into their software and roll it out to customers. And that's exactly what happened. A strategic foreign adversary compromised SolarWinds' software so that when you downloaded it, you downloaded their malicious software as well, which gave them access unfettered for about 14 months into about 18,000 organizations across the world, ranging from government agencies and Department of Energy and things like that, down to enterprises and banks and companies like that, to infrastructure providers like power sector, as well as to other suppliers. So when we look at this problem and we think about the complexity that we're trying to solve, it's not just a supply chain, it's an interwoven supply chain, and it's an understanding what that connectivity and scale means to us, which some people will talk about digital transformation and kind of the connectivity around the world for our companies. And when you really want to get ahead of that, you better dig in deep and understand the complexity as well as your adversary. Otherwise, they're going to run circles around you. When you look at SolarWinds, you kind of want to take it a level down and you want to understand, why was this so interesting? There's kind of two components to it. First is the impact, the fact that they got into 18,000 organizations around the world, the adversary taking advantage of SolarWinds. That impact is pretty big. Regardless if the adversary did something basic to get there or something sophisticated, who cares? It worked. But the things they did was also pretty sophisticated. So it gets a lot of our attention. What they were able to do is break into SolarWinds' organization, go into their engineering and research and development portions of their networks, learn how they were developing the software, and inject themselves into the build process. So as these engineers would go and build new software, the adversaries would have their software check, make sure that the build process was running smoothly, and then inject their code into that build process, injecting it then into the newest version of SolarWinds. So if you think about it, it's not just about breaking into an organization and understanding it, but they understood everything, including the build processes and where to inject the code to be stealthy and make sure they get out to these organizations. Now, when they got out to those organizations and customers around the world downloaded SolarWinds, they opened up remote access to the adversaries. So the adversaries had remote access to, like I said, around 18,000 organizations in the world, down to their core network components. And a lot of discussion was on the enterprise IT side of the house, so the information technology side, the emails, the servers, things like that. There was some visibility that we had on that, that made everybody uncomfortable about where all they got access. But part of the problem was there was also portions of your organization, like the industrial components or the power plant or the nuclear power plant or the manufacturing line, that we don't historically have as much security efforts into in visibility. And so in many ways, from a practitioner level up to the presidential level, people felt that we were flying blind with an understanding of where did this adversary access, and the obvious question of, are they gone? And the reality is we don't know. So when we talk about trying to get a hold of this problem, it starts with a visibility and understanding of what are we trying to protect. We have to inform ourselves with what are the adversaries able to do. And we have to inform ourselves and ground ourselves in an understanding of the consequence to say, regardless of who does this, what are they able to do when they have this access? And it's that marriage of insight from the adversaries, what we'll call intelligence, and understanding of impact, we'll talk about in consequence. It's that intel and consequence combination that security professionals really need to take serious and work with organizational leadership to make sure we get ahead of. There's a common nature for people to look at something and go, wow, that's sophisticated. When in reality, a lot of the things we see are things we've known can happen, but adversaries weren't just brazen enough to do it. We know you can take down electric power. There's not many adversaries that are doing it, not because they can't, but because there's barriers for it or deterrents around it or reasons that they might not be willing to do it. And so when you look at things like SolarWinds and then supply chain compromises, I don't think many security professionals would look around and think, oh, it's incredibly difficult to compromise our supply chain. Instead, it's more of, well, I don't think they would want to do that, or I don't think the mythical they would go that far. And what we're seeing time and time again is we vastly underestimate our strategic adversaries into what they're willing to do and why they're willing to do it. So instead of trying to pretend that we can understand every motivation of every strategic adversary, it's really important to identify where the security gaps are, where they're really critical for us, and go close those security gaps. So was SolarWinds sophisticated? Yes, it absolutely was. Was it shocking that somebody tried to compromise the supply chain this way? No, folks have been talking about it for a long time. But when we marry up that understanding of let's go after the basics as well as the sophisticated challenges and be mindful that if we know there's risk, we need to address it, that's where we're going to start moving this discussion forward. For all of us in the community to solve challenges, we need to have visibility into what the problem is. You got to start there. What is the problem? Then let's fix it. And the reality is, globally, we have a collection bias. And what that means is we're very commonly looking in one area and looking for the challenges there. But where we're not looking, we just hope and assume that maybe there are challenges. And of course, that's not how it works. Supply chain is a great example. We haven't really, as a community, taken a deep look into what is our supply chain and who's our suppliers' suppliers and how are they connected. So we shouldn't be shocked that when we start looking, we start seeing things. And this is true for every organization. When I started out at the National Security Agency, there was so many folks that thought there's no such thing as industrial specific threats, operations, technology, or OT. Surely there's not anything going down in the power plant, in the rail line, etc. And then I asked the question, are we collecting data from there? Do we have insights from there? The response was, well, no. Well, let's go validate that assumption. And as we started collecting data, lo and behold, we started seeing adversaries. And there they were, taking advantage of those blind spots that we have. Whether it's industrial, whether it's portions of your own enterprise, whether it's discussions about the application layer inside the network that we're looking at, or supply chain, where we don't look, we can't make assumptions. We have to posit ideas and then go validate them. So when you take that in concept of the attacks we're seeing, some of them are very obvious. I was involved and led up the incident response and investigation work of the 2015 cyber attack in Ukraine on their electric power system. It was the first time ever a cyber attack took down electric power. And before then, the idea was people aren't doing this and they don't want to. What did we see? Turns out adversaries were learning and training and preparing for that exact moment. And we just didn't pay attention until the lights went out. And then it was kind of obvious that something was wrong. 2016 Ukraine happened again, different level and scope. 2017 Saudi Arabia, first ever cyber attack to try to kill people by causing an explosion in a petrochemical facility. 2018 to now, massive levels of supply chain compromise, accessing infrastructure sites around the world, et cetera, all going back to that point of visibility. And it's not a product or service or whatever level of visibility, it's an understanding that where you're not looking and where you're not paying attention allows the opportunity for the adversaries to be present. Now, you don't have the time to look everywhere, but if something is critical to you, or if you understand the consequence of what would happen if it was compromised, you should look. When we look 10 years out and think about where security might be, the reality is it's hard to predict, and I don't want to pretend to be an oracle here. That being said, what we're seeing now at a pace we've never seen before is a digital transformation across the world, and that means not only in hyperconnectivity, but also the evolution of our technology stacks. We're able to do more now than we ever were before. That the kid coming out of high school can step in and be productive in your organization based on all this automation and removing of complexity to allow them to be successful. The problem in that removal of the complexity and our understanding of it leaves a lot of space and inner workings of how our applications and networks and systems or industrial systems or whatever work and operate, unless people understand that. And now the adversary can learn all of that space that we don't have an understanding of and thrive in that complexity. So our security professionals need to dig deeper more than ever before to understand that complexity so that we get ahead of our adversaries and they can't turn what makes our world beautiful and wonderful against us. When I look at security's contributions outside of the security professional, here's kind of how I think about it. I think about it in the practitioners that are designing and implementing the systems. I think about it in the executives and the board level, and I think about the role and responsibility of government. And very briefly, I'll simply state that at the designer and engineer level, I expect you to design out some of the functionality that adversaries take advantage of that don't contribute to your mission. In other words, if I've got a pipeline that allows lye to be dumped into, or pipe allows lye to be dumped into the water system, do I ever really need it to allow 1,000 parts or 1,000,000 parts, per milliliter? Maybe I can just design the pipe not to allow that. Do I have an operating system that shouldn't allow me to lock every file on my system all at once from a ransomware attack? Let's just design that out. Removing attack surface is one of the best things we can do at that level. At a board level, I expect the executives to understand the cyber risk, not the metrics. 1,000 scans of a firewall, 5 million emails, nobody cares. What I expect is, what are the scenarios we as a business need to be able to prepare for, kind of like a disaster recovery plan, and then a very binary choice. Do we want to prepare for it or not? Yes or no? Then let the organization figure out what's required in investment to be able to achieve the level of understanding and protection and response that we want towards those scenarios. When I think about the government, I expect their role to be in setting the rules, but not being a player. I want them to understand how to build an ecosystem, how to influence innovation, how to invest in the community, how to set base level regulations of what you should do to be a good community member, especially with things like security. But I then don't expect them to build their own technology, provide their own services, or otherwise be a player in the space. Amplification, education, sharing a best practice, investment, and the ugly lane of regulation sometimes, but not be a player on the field. So with all that, thank you very much for having me. Good luck on the rest of your conference and have a great day.